Good evening. On behalf of the Newark Public Library, welcome. I'm Tom Ankner, the supervising librarian in charge of the library's Charles F. Cummings, New Jersey Information Center. As most of you know, the Star-Ledger, once Newark's hometown newspaper, will be ending print publication on Sunday. The paper will continue as an online site, but it was felt that the end of a physical newspaper should be commemorated in some way. The Newark Public Library is pleased tonight to be hosting this discussion among three veteran staffers with the Ledger. Retired reporter Guy Sterling will be moderating the discussion with legendary sports writer Jerry Eisenberg and Jonathan E. Lazarus, the paper's former night managing editor. We ask that everyone keep their cameras and microphones off during the interview. If you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat box. We will get to as many as possible at the end of the program. Now, it is my distinct honor to introduce tonight's moderator. Guy Sterling spent almost 30 years as a general assignment reporter in Newark, retiring from the Star-Ledger in 2009. He won a national award for excellence in music writing and was a member of the Star-Ledger staff that won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting. Also, a story of his was used as the theme for an award-winning season of the HBO series The Sopranos. And when he left daily journalism, he was given a retirement party by the mob and a plaque for his organized crime coverage by the U.S. Justice Department. Guy was a lead reporter in the Star-Ledger's coverage of the fatal dormitory fire at Seton Hall University in 2000, stories that continued for years. They earned the paper its first ever selection as a Pulitzer Prize finalist, along with the American Society of Newspaper Editors Jesse Leventhal Prize for deadline news reporting by a team in 2001. Now, here is Guy Sterling. Guy?
Thank you, Tom. First off, my sincere thanks to you, Beth Zach Cohen, and the Newark Public Library for hosting tonight's program. And thanks also to Jerry and John for agreeing to participate. And thanks to our viewers for tuning in as we draw closer to Sunday when the Star-Ledger's final print edition rolls off the presses. Let me begin by saying I thought it was a gut-wrenching enough when the paper abandoned Newark in 2014 for Woodbridge, leaving the city without a daily newspaper for the first time in 175 years. But the news that the paper was completely going out of print hit even harder, and I'm sure Jerry and John feel the same way. It's a sinking feeling that I feel could last a long time. Jerry Eisenberg, of course, needs no introduction. He's been a sports writer and a sports columnist for more than 70 years, 7-0, and has won just about every writing award there is, short of the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize. His first byline in the Ledger was in 1951, covering a high school baseball tournament, and he's still writing for both the paper and its online counterpart, NJ.com. I dare say Jerry has had more bylines in the Ledger than anyone. A Rutgers graduate like Jerry, John Lazarus came to the Star-Ledger in 1967 after 3 years at the Newark Evening News and rose through the ranks at the Ledger to become the paper's news copy chief and night managing editor before retiring in 2006. For anyone who hasn't read it, I would highly recommend John's article about the Ledger's demise that appeared in the November 22nd, 2024 edition of the New Jersey Jewish News. Welcome to you both, each a former colleague and a friend.
Thanks, Guy.
I think the best way of taking our trip down memory lane tonight is to do it chronologically, but I first want to ask Jerry a question about one of his assignments that I found very intriguing before asking both of you the question overarching tonight's discussion. Jerry, when reviewing your work, I saw that your third byline in 1951 came while covering the 44th annual regatta of the Newark Yacht and Motor Club on the Passaic River. Since yacht clubs and regattas aren't things people usually associate with Newark, will you please tell us a little bit about that event?
Well, the amazing thing to me at that time was that it happened. I mean, there was so much pollution and so many problems with cleanliness and everything else. I really believed I could have won it walking across that water. So it didn't draw much of a crowd. A lot of, well, actually up in Belleville and Nutley, they had high school crews. And I think probably those kids were on the shore, you know, or in some little boat watching a race.
Mm-hmm.
It was, the thing about it was, I also covered the the big international race. It was won by an Australian boat called Gretel. I kept looking for Hansel all through the race. I remember that race that was up in Newport because we passed the home away from home of the Kennedy clan, and they were playing touch football, and I saw John F. Kennedy go out for a pass and drop it. One other experience I had with water, I went down to the United States Navy. Well, I covered crew for a while for the Ledger, which was amazing to me because it's a very un-Newark kind of sport. And Navy was in a tri-meet with Columbia and somebody else at Annapolis. And the sun went down on the Severn just as we were running out of gas in the reporter boat. And we drifted through the darkness for I don't know how long. Don't worry, don't worry. We kept getting messages to the guy driving our boat. Driving is the apt word, not leading, not piloting it. And he said, "Don't worry, the rescue boat's on its way." I look up and I see what had to be the last remnant of the Bay of Pigs reunion coming toward us. And I got to tell you, it was pretty scary because it was black. We couldn't see the shore. But anyway, I got rid of water assignments as quickly as possible.
Okay. Jerry and John, I want to ask you both the same question, the overarching question of our discussion tonight, and that is, what do we in New Jersey stand to lose with the loss of the Star Ledger's print edition after 86 years? And do you think there was any way that this could have been avoided? John, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. First, apologize for my voice. I hope it holds up. We're losing a very trusted companion in our daily lives, something that we could hold in our hand, look at, something that informed us, something that entertained us, something that challenged us. And it put us closer to the heartbeat of local, county, and state government. It put us closer to cultural events. It put us closer to athletic events. It put us closer to scientific challenges like Superfund sites and pollution. And it kept us informed of the doings in these areas. And sure, there will be an online version of the Ledger, but it won't have that same immediacy, that same tactile sensation that the paper had. And Jerry and I both grew up as avid newspaper readers, as I'm sure you did, Guy. I have 4 grandchildren. They're all college graduates. They're all well-connected. They're all well-informed. But I don't think any of them have ever read a newspaper regularly. And that's where the disconnect is coming in.
Mm-hmm. Jerry, you want to add something?
Yeah, I look at the whole business. And you guys, I asked directly because you were the heart and soul of my newspaper, the Star Ledger. Have you ever, how many retractions of bogus, outrageous stories have you seen on the internet? I don't think I've ever seen one. Oh, there'll be another headline tomorrow. No way. Don't worry about being wrong about everything today. The biggest loss to the whole country with the headline, with the papers going out of business, so many of them, is that they can never be sure they're getting the truth. If you read it in the newspaper, it was true. And if it wasn't true, a day later you'd see a big box, "We made a mistake." You're never going to see that because the internet doesn't make mistakes. It's got artificial intelligence. It's going to, in the end, it's going to take over the whole thing. I dread that day because I had a fight with a robot who never had the answer to my question, plugged into him. And then can you imagine a piece of metal saying, "I'm sorry about that, I'll go find out"? No. The Star Ledger was, I'm 94. all but 24 years of my life are been spent with the Star Ledger.
Mhm.
I just, heart and soul, I just want to take one more moment to say this. We had the best damn sports section in the country.
Jerry, we're going to get to that later on.
Okay, I just wanted to say it.
Okay, so let's look at the paper from a chronological point of view. As many people know, the Star Ledger's name comes from the merging of the names of two former Newark newspapers, the Newark Ledger and the Newark Star Eagle. That occurred in 1939 at the behest of Samuel Irving Newhouse, known as SI or Sam. Newhouse had gotten the Newark Ledger out of a court-imposed trusteeship in 1935. The paper had been founded in 1917 by Lucius T. Russell, a notorious and flamboyant figure in the newspaper world at the time. The Newark Ledger had moved its office from place to place. It was on Washington Street and it was on Bank Street. But that changed in 1939 when Newhouse picked up the Newark Star Eagle, a failing afternoon paper that had essentially been put out of business by another afternoon paper, the Newark Evening News. We have our first slide here. You can see this is the building where the Newark Star Eagle had its operation. You can see its name up top, and down below over the front doors is the sign of the Newark Star Ledger. What Newhouse got in his purchase of the Star Eagle was the paper's name, its circulation, and most importantly, a newspaper office and printing plant on Halsey Street that was cutting edge for its time. It was located right behind where Hobby's Deli is today, but this building no longer stands. With those two names now joined under the same roof in a single operation, the paper became the Newark Star Ledger. Jerry, here's my question for you. I'm not sure how many people from the Newark Star Eagle that Newhouse hired for his newly named newspaper. Let me read to you a description of the Star Eagle's news staff that was written by one of its reporters. And this is a quote. "They were frustrated playwrights, amiable drunks, glib con men, brassy photographers, hotshot reporters lured by the mirage of the Pulitzer Prize or enhanced in their own self-esteem by the repertorial performances of actors Clark Gable and Lee Tracy, budding novelists fresh from Harvard, brash cubs from the gutter, young men on their way up, old men on their way down." Is that how you found the staff of the Newark Star Ledger when you began in 1951? You must have encountered some real characters. As a case in point, what about the Ledger's outdoor writer, Nelson Benedict, who enjoyed a huge following among readers, and how his car came to wind up on some railroad tracks one night? Would you share that story with us?
Well, Nelson was a drunk. I mean, it's that simple. But he was in that newsroom. He was a drunk among other drunks, and he was always in trouble. But he conned somebody. I don't know who it was. He covered the World Tuna Fishing Championship in Argentina, and I told Nelson, "You should have been in Brooklyn covering ice fishing." I mean, nobody knows even where Argentina is in this newsroom. And it was, he did a million things. He was an unregistered agent for gun groups. I mean, manufacturers. Anyway, one day Nelson gets in an argument in a bar. Where else? He's driving home. He lived in Fairhaven, New Jersey. He says, "You're wrong, and I'll go prove it to you." And he goes to his car, he brings a shotgun out of the car and points it at the guy. Now, do you want to change his story? Well, they threw him out of it. He said, "Not till I have one more drink, one more drink." Well, he had 3 one more drinks. He's driving the car home. It stops. He's out of gas. He picked the Jersey Central Railroad track to run out of gas, right square in the middle of it. So Nelson said, "Well, I got another drink before I go home." So he walked away, found a bar, and that was it. The train came through and demolished Nelson's car. Nelson's wife got a state police call. A guy called and he said, "He may be all right, so we don't know, but we couldn't find a body." And she said, well, the SOB finally did it, didn't he? That was Nelson Benedict.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about the Halsey Street building. A woman I talked to last week who worked there told me that the editorial department had no air conditioning except for a couple window units in offices. The heat outside was so stifling in the summer that salt pills were available at the water coolers to minimize the risk of heat strokes. The only time the staff saw S.I. Newhouse in the warm weather was when he was running to get into his air-conditioned office. And you can see in the picture, there are a couple offices that have the window units, and other windows are open. And she also said that some of the production equipment was on the top floor, often making the newsroom dusty and noisy. Jerry, does that align with your memory?
It doesn't even begin to tell it. It was the worst working condition. If we didn't have OSHA, that's the reason it should have been formed. It was amazing to me. The presses were on the top. First of all, the building was an old stable in the 1800s. It was used as a stable. I don't know what they needed with those. Well, somebody added the top floor. The presses were on the top floor. We never sold many papers in the beginning. When I was here in the beginning, when I came here, it was like 80,000 circulation and never passed the Newark City line. But the big paper was Thanksgiving. We got the ads that kept us alive for quite a while for Thanksgiving weekend. And when they would turn the presses on, we would all run out of the building because the whole building would shake and crap would be coming from the third floor through their floor and through our ceiling. It was like knowing that a volcano is going to erupt. You just don't know the time and date. And it was scary, but it was funny. We laughed about it. We laughed about a lot of things in that building.
Yeah. Okay. John, you were in the Halsey Street building too, once as a high school student. Do you have a recollection of the feeling you had heading down there and being in the building?
I was there once. I came down while I was in high school to apply for a job as a copy boy. I didn't get it. The overwhelming feeling was that it was a gilded dump, that it had all the trappings that a real, genuine Hollywood set newspaper plant should have. And that was the only time I was in the old building. But if you want to match old buildings, the Newark News, the Gray Lady of Market Street.
John, that's going to be my next question.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Okay. So the paper changed its name to just the Star Ledger in 1964 and remained on Halsey Street until 1966, when it moved to a new state-of-the-art newspaper plant on Court Street between University Avenue and Washington Street. The building was substantially larger than the one on Halsey Street and had printing presses a block long in its sub-basement that shook the walls when they were fired up and running. John, would you contrast for us the Newark Evening News building that you left on Market Street with the modern Ledger building on Court Street?
The Newark News building was a logistical nightmare. It was between Market Street and a back alley on one side, Mulberry, and a back street. They couldn't get their trucks in or out properly. They were a PM paper competing with market closings, which television had taken over. And normally their trucks would get caught in downtown traffic, and the afternoon editions would get delivered late after people had seen the results on television. The composing room was something that would do credit to Charles Dickens. It was dark, it was dank. The operators all looked like they were glued to their linotype machines, old guys operating in the dark. It was a vertical operation. The newsroom was absolutely, shockingly old. They had copy was sent up not in pneumatic tubes, but on belts to be set. It was something out of the previous century.
And just for the record, after the new Ledger building opened in 1966, the newsroom was moved to two other locations inside the premises and upgraded to keep up with changing technology. And also, for the record, printing on Court Street ceased in the early 1980s, but the paper remained on Court Street until the building was sold to become a storage facility for fine art while the news operation moved out of Newark. Since the Star Ledger was the brainchild of S.I. Newhouse Sr., let's focus on him. Tom, could we have that slide of S.I. Newhouse, please? Yes, that one. Newhouse was born in 1895, the oldest of 8 children, who took over as head of the family when he was 13 and his father fell ill. He studied to become a lawyer, but instead made his mark in newspapers. As the story goes, his first shot at running a newspaper came when he was a teenager working for a lawyer who was given a failing paper in Bayonne to pay off a legal debt. Despite his age and inexperience, Newhouse was put in charge of the paper and turned it around. Newhouse later set out on a mission to own more daily papers in America than anyone, and he achieved that goal, eventually owning 30 or so of them across the country. So successful was he that he made a run at owning both the New York Times and, according to one biographer, almost acquired the Washington Post. His notoriety as a newspaper owner landed Newhouse on the cover of Time magazine on July 27, 1962. This is it. By the way, Time described Newhouse as standing 5 feet 3 inches and weighing 136 pounds. Can we move to the next slide, Tom? Newhouse had 2 sons, both of whom followed him into publishing. Donald first ran the Ledger on Halsey Street, and then the family's entire newspaper operation, entire newspaper business for several decades after his father's death in 1979. He is still alive and in his mid-90s. The other son, S.I. Jr., was put in charge of the family's magazines, including Vogue, Vanity Fair, and The New Yorker. He died in 2017. If I'm not mistaken, Donald's 2 sons, Stephen and Michael, currently run Advanced Publications, the parent company of the Star Ledger, and there are other family members involved in the operation. Jerry, you worked for S.I. Newhouse. You were also working at the Ledger before Donald Newhouse arrived. You've told me some interesting things about them in recent days. One was that S.I. Newhouse was no fun to work for, and 2, that Donald not only insisted that the paper emphasize local news, but that he also opened up the paper's news hole with additional pages. What stands out in your mind about each man?
Well, S.I. was a guy I'm senior. I don't really want to comment about him because I didn't like working for him, but I like working. And everybody else here liked working. But when Donald came a year after I became the columnist. And Mort Pye, who deserves great praise.
Yeah, we're going to get to him next, Jerry.
Yeah, okay. But it was Mort Pye who said to me, when Donald, he said, you know what he said to me today? He said, I don't like the ratio of ads to news. I thought the same thing that Mort thought when he heard that comment, but we were both wrong. He said, if you have to go up 4, 8 pages, no ads, do it. We're a newspaper. To me, he was a great, great publisher. You know, all I can say about him is I got some sort of reputation, not necessarily good, for my defense of Muhammad Ali. We lost ads over that defense. I told him, I'm not going to stop because he's entitled to go through the court system. That's the way this country's structured. And I said, Donald, if you want to fire me, do it. If you want to ask me to leave, I'll probably go. But I'm not going to stop because I believe in this. I don't know to this day whether he agreed with me or didn't agree, but all he said was, I run the paper. Let me run the paper. You write the column. I have no desire to write the column. And he let me do whatever I wanted to do.
Beautiful. John, you told me there were no deep dives with S.I. Newhouse, that he essentially ran his business out of his head and his briefcase with a crack legal team behind him. It's amazing that someone could be so successful that way and build $1 billion business. What's your take on how this happened?
Well, he and his brothers kept it very tightly among themselves in the family. They're still the largest privately held publishing outfit in the country. I never met Mr. Newhouse Personally, I used to see his limousine from New York pull up to the Star Ledger building, our new building, and he was a very short guy, and he'd bounce out and go up his private staircase to the office. And once we met in the hallway, and he smiled at me, and he just ran a business counterintuitively and unconventionally. And in his case, he made it work, and he made it work for decades.
Okay. Tom, can we have our next slide, please? One of the smartest moves Newhouse made was bringing Mort Pye over from the Long Island Press to Newark in 1957 to be associate editor and grooming him to take over the Ledger. Pye, who was married into the Newhouse family, assumed the editor's position in 1963, and over the next 30 plus years, transformed the Ledger into one of the biggest and most successful daily papers in America. He became so well known and respected that he was inducted into the New Jersey Hall of Fame in the class of 2020-21. On his watch, the paper's daily weekday circulation peaked at around 450,000 copies a day, and Sunday circulation reached 750,000. The weekday paper could run to 100 pages, Sunday's paper to 300 pages or more. John and Jerry, I'd like each of you to describe Mort Pye as a person and as an editor and your dealings with him. And John, I would like you to tell us about the time you went chair shopping with him and your interactions with him on a nightly basis, particularly when the paper's first edition came off the presses. To me, they say a lot about the man.
Yes.
Jerry, John,
Well-
John, why don't you go first?
Okay. There is a lot to say about Mort. My career at the Star Ledger was so intertwined with him. And he was a man who paid attention to details, large and small. He could be thinking in broad brushstrokes about the paper and the next investigation, but he would also think about the chairs that he wanted to buy for the newsroom, which were more ergonomically appropriate. So one day he, Chick Harrison, Andy Stasiak, and myself, the four of us went up to Shaw Walker in Milburn, a chair manufacturing company. And we spent the morning going from sitting from chair to chair to chair to chair. And Mort said, the only reason you're along for this is because you're tall. And I just want to make sure we get the proper specifications. And he finally found the chairs that suited him. Now, it was a very small detail that you wouldn't think the editor of a major newspaper would get involved in, but that was more to a T. Anything that affected the Ledger affected Mort. As far as my daily interactions with him, when I succeeded Dick Strong and became the news editor and then night managing editor, every evening the presses would start at 11:35, and a messenger would take a copy of the Bulldog edition, the first edition, up to Mort's house in South Orange, about 10, 15 minutes away. And Mort would go over the paper, and I would get the call, just as Dick Strong had gotten the call. And it could be a very detailed call about things that he wanted changed, or a very surfacey call that he was generally pleased with the paper. It could range from changing a headline to repositioning a story to adding 6 points of white space. Again, Mort was consumed by the details that went into every edition of the Star Ledger. And then he'd bid me good night, and I'd say good night to him. And I would look forward to starting the process within 24 hours. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being to work for, savvy and caring and passionate about the Ledger.
Jerry, your turn.
Well, when you think about Newark and all the papers it had, and one as great as the Newark News, with its reputation, you realize they all failed to do what Mort did, which is the reason Mort became the king of all the Newark newspapers. And the Ledger became the king of all the Newark newspapers. Donald and he had a discussion, and Donald said, I want this paper to be known nationally, But more important, I want no stone unturned in getting every single local story we could find. Because he did believe that all news is local in the end. How does it affect our people? And he was tremendous at that. And he would do anything for the good of the paper, even if he didn't understand it. I knock on the door one day and I said, listen, I'm not gonna be here. I'm going to Africa on Thursday. I'll be gone for 2 weeks. He said, you going on vacation? I said, are you out of your mind? No, Ali is fighting Holmes. Uh,
Foreman.
and he looked at me and he said, do we need this fight? I said, yes, you need this fight. He said, then go. I mean, we didn't even have the sports department, might have been the only department in the paper that had no budget. I mean, I went to 26 countries, and I would say 3/4 of them were paid for by the Star Ledger. If there was a story, and it had to be a story that people wanted to read in Newark, New Jersey. I try to give them that. And I will say, we never really argued, ever.
Mhm.
And,
Okay.
and that's a blessing when you got a guy who can
Yeah,
take your
absolutely.
job away.
Tom, can we have our next slide, please? After the paper moved from Halsey Street to Court Street, it really began to take off. Some might say that was because, in part, the Newark Evening News had gone out of business in 1972. Others might argue it was because the price of the paper was always kept so low. When I started, it was 15 cents daily and 35 cents Sunday. Few, however, would ever doubt the overwhelming appeal of the paper's sports section, something that you, Jerry, were a big part of. You've told me that Willie Klein, who became the Ledger's longtime sports editor after earlier being a sports reporter and a sports columnist for the paper, was chiefly responsible for that. Jerry, would you describe the evolution of the paper's sports section and Willie's role in that? And also mention anyone else beside yourself who was responsible for its incredible growth. As an aside, I would like to add, on the size of the sports staff, I remember 4 sports writers alone covering horse racing when I got to the Star Ledger. Jerry?
Well, that was true. That was very true. I went to the Derby. I did 58 Kentucky Derbies. Of course, Mort was gone and Donald was pulling back a little at the end. But I covered the Kentucky Derby first with Bob Hardy, the best general assignment reporter in sports I ever knew. Then Bob dropped out, and then I had 2 or 3 others, and then along came Tom Lucci. Tom Lucci was typical of Ledger staffers. He had 3 beats: horse racing, college sports, and college basketball, college football. And he was the best, the absolute best college guy around. Typical. Well, we had guys, they knew their sports. That was the big thing about it. And I'll tell you, a guy who is now the sports director for NJ.com or what would you call them? They were they do the grunt work and the creative work for NJ.com, which is the Star Ledger, and now will be more the Star Ledger because there'll be no print paper, and everything that we did once NJ.com got rolling, wound up there before it got in our paper.
Right. Okay. Jerry, take a break for a moment. I'm going to focus on John with a few questions. John, you ready?
Ready?
Okay. John, you began working at the Star Ledger after 3 years at the Newark Evening News. I want to ask you a series of questions about that. Let's go one by one. How did the Newark Evening News look upon the Star Ledger when you were there?
It looked down upon it. It thought itself impregnable, the state paper, and that the Star Ledger traded in softer, fluffier stuff, wasn't serious, and they were smug in feeling that way, and that wasn't the reality of the situation after Mort got there at all.
Mm-hmm. You've already told us about how the 2 buildings differed in appearance, but would you contrast for us how the 2 operations differed in their news philosophies.
Right. The Newark News staff was first of all, the Scudders ran a Republican-leaning newspaper in a Democratic-leaning state, and certainly a Democratic county. The Newark News was very cozy with the downtown Newark business establishment. Their staff was an aging staff and was comfortable in its beats and wasn't very aggressive or enterprising in seeking out controversial stuff. That was my impression of the Newark News. When I was in the Elizabeth Bureau of the Newark News, before I came to the downtown building, we had a staff of 7 or 8 correspondents covering Union County. The Star Ledger had one, Louis Mogalever, and Louis used to out-hustle and out-scoop the 7 or 8 people from the Newark News. And this was apparent to me when I came over to the Ledger. The staff was nimbler, hungrier, more enterprising, and they were doing serious work. The Newark News had been living on its past laurels, and Mort was very, very eager when I went for my interview with him, where he hired me after about 10 minutes on a handshake, was very eager to to take talent from the Newark News and get them over to the Ledger. And he was succeeding. And of course, I came to total fruition when the newspaper, the Newark News, folded in 1972. And
Right.
we took some of the Newark News.
Right. I'm going to mention those in a moment. How
Sure.
did you handle the transition from the Newark Evening News to the Star Ledger?
On a personal basis,
Yeah.
it was very easy. I had to learn new metrics for headline writing, new style for editing, but those were things that a good copy editor could do in a matter of a few days. But the culture of the Star Ledger was easygoing, but not as flip as the Newark News culture had been. The Newark News culture was really ossified. It was a bunch of older white guys set in their ways and thinking that all they could do was pontificate, and the state business leaders would follow, the political establishment would follow. The Ledger went after stories. But I will say that both papers, when the riots struck in 1967, were ill-prepared to deal with the breaking news that was happening around them. But my personal transition to the Star Ledger went very smoothly. I felt I fit right in, and I enjoyed myself from the start.
Right. Why don't you just talk briefly about covering that event in 1967, what it was like?
It was scary. I was at the Newark News at the time, and I was actually in the Army Reserves, and I was afraid that my unit might be activated. We had the previous 2 summers, we had riot training at summer camp, and I drove into the city, and in the afternoon, before darkness, and we put out the paper, and we stayed in the center of that city room, and a lot of lights were doused. And then at the end of the shift at night or early in the morning, I had a police escort back to my car, and I would follow the National Guard convoys out of the city on MacArthur Highway. And it's kind of surreal to be processing copy about a riot that's going on right outside your window, and working on the story at the same time.
Right. Okay. Would you recount for us the meeting you told me about when Mort called the Star Ledger staff together to announce that the Newark Evening News was going out of business and what that meant for the Ledger?
Right. The Newark Evening News actually in its last couple of years had been printed on Star Ledger presses. We were putting out the Newark News. And when Mort made the announcement that the news was going under and the Ledger was acquiring its name, assets, whatever, goodwill, we gathered in the city room and Mort gave us a pep talk, and he wasn't usually a rah-rah guy. And he said that essentially this was a golden opportunity for the Star Ledger to expand, to take advantage of this, and to truly enlarge its reach in New Jersey, to become the newspaper for New Jersey, which was ultimately the credo on our nameplate, the newspaper for New Jersey. And he was excited, and he imparted this sense of excitement to the staff that we were embarking on a new, bigger journey for the Star Ledger, and great things lay ahead.
Right. So I had written down the names of some of the Newark News people that Mort carried over to the Star Ledger. I'll just read some off to you, just so we know that. There was a story I heard once when I came to the paper that he was reluctant to hire Newark News reporters, but this list tells me that that story was not true. So we'll go with Joan Babbage, Bill Cantfield, John Farmer, Shirley Friedman, Bill Gordon, John McLaughlin, Al Milch, Tom Walker, Vince Cerati, and maybe there were others. So I guess Mort knew what he wanted, saw what he wanted, and it made no difference to him that they were from the competing newspaper.
And they were very good choices, very good choices.
Yes. Okay. So if both of you will indulge me for a moment, I'd like to briefly focus on the history of the Court Street site, because I think it's something most people don't know, and it's really quite fascinating. Who knew that that little plot of land where the Star Ledger building still is had once been the entertainment capital of Newark? Up until the time that the Ledger building was put up, the property had been home to any number of theaters in what was mostly an industrial area. Right after the Civil War, an indoor roller skating facility known as the Rink that faced Washington Street at the back of the property was situated there. It was also used for large theatrical productions and other kinds of entertainment, as well as civic activities. Tom, can we have our next slide? This is the building. This is looking north from on Washington Street toward Court Street. It was also where the Newark Industrial Exhibitions were held starting in 1872. These were large-scale showcases introducing to the country and really to the world all of the varied and amazing industrial products that Newark was manufacturing at the time. In that election year of 1872, both presidential candidates, President Ulysses S. Grant, who was seeking re-election, and his opponent, newspaperman Horace Greeley, showed up in Newark to campaign and stopped by the exhibition. Grant returned the following year, and upon returning to Washington, convinced William Tecumseh Sherman, one of his top Civil War generals, to travel to Newark as well to see the 1873 exhibition. Sherman, in turn, told General George Armstrong Custer that he had to go to see what was going on in Newark too. And Custer did just that before losing his life at the Battle of the Little Bighorn 3 years later in 1876, all on the site of what later became the Star Ledger. Can we have our next slide? In succeeding years, the Rink became home to the Grand Opera House, the popular and well-regarded Columbia Theater Company. You can see its name on the over the marquee, Jacobs Theater, and the Family Theater. Can we have the next slide? A little later, the Orpheum Theater was built adjacent to the old Rink building closer to Court Street, but still on the Star Ledger, what became the Star Ledger property, and featured black acts. One story I read had to do with the great black heavyweight champion Jack Johnson, after he'd retired from prize fighting, sang to packed houses there for a week in November 25, at a show in which he also invited any audience member brave enough up to the stage to spar with him. Can we have our next slide? The Orpheum was then renovated and run for 26 years as the Newark Opera House, once again on the property where the Star Ledger was later built, which drew some of the biggest names in opera from throughout Europe. That building was demolished in 1963 to make way for the Star Ledger. Without downplaying the importance of the factors I previously mentioned that added to the Ledger's success over the years, there's little doubt that one of Mort Pye's smartest moves was adding staff and boosting coverage, not only across New Jersey's geographical landscape with news bureaus in almost every county in the state, but also in the kinds of news and feature stories the paper published over such a wide spectrum of topics. Was there any stone left unturned? From politics and government, to business, to education, transportation, the environment, legal affairs, to science, to health and medicine, to courthouses, to local and county news, to Trenton, to the arts, and so on, all while keeping sports coverage at the highest level. Sure, there were places where the paper could have been tougher and places where the Ledger lagged behind other papers. But in my view, no one can argue that what Mort Pye did in building his newspaper while simultaneously boosting state pride wasn't a masterful stroke. John, we all know about the growth in news coverage at the paper, and Jerry told us about the growth in sports, but I also saw the night staff grow immeasurably while I was at the paper. How did that come about?
Well, one of the areas where we wanted to tighten things up was the copy desk. And when I came to the paper, we had a very small staff of regulars on the desk. We used extras, guys who would come over from New York City papers, work a shift at the paper. We started hiring copy editors, full-time staffers. We wanted consistency in our headlines and in our editing. As far as the Nightside rewrite, we added Nightside reporters. We added bench strength to Cityside reporters. We put special emphasis on hiring minority and Black reporters, especially after the riots. We wanted to increase our bench strength there. Generally speaking, we grew the Nightside staff because that's when the paper was put together. That's when we had to excel on late-breaking stuff. And we were, after all, a morning newspaper. And so during my earliest years there, Mort was growing that Nightside staff.
Right. And you also had to add people because the technology was changing.
I'm sorry, Guy.
You added people because the technology was changing too.
Absolutely. We could add people in the bureaus, which we did, because we could get their copy to us more readily. And the technology itself created the need for IT people, specialists, and again, that was another part of the staff expansion that we experienced under Mort. The photography staff was expanded. Our coverage of cultural and entertainment events at night was expanded. So, as you said previously, Mort expanded in all areas and all things Jersey that the paper needed to cover.
Right. Tom, can we have our next slide? So Mort Pye retired in 1994. He died 3 years later and was replaced in 1995 by Jim Wilsey. Wilsey had been a news editor with the Associated Press in San Francisco, then managing editor of the San Francisco Examiner, and finally editor and publisher of the Daily News in New York. On Wilsey's watch, no doubt with the benefit of massive underwriting by the Newhouses, the Star Ledger added staff once again. Little to anything was apparently spared in the way of spending to address whatever was needed to improve the reporting, writing, editing, and presentation of the news. This largely resulted in the paper winning Pulitzer Prizes, the first one awarded to Matt Rainey for feature photography in the aftermath of the fatal Seton Hall dormitory fire in 2000. Another Pulitzer was added to the list a few years later, this one going to the staff for breaking news when then Governor Jim McGreevey left his job in scandal in 2004. With these two honors coming back to back, almost back to back, along with a slew of other major and state national awards, it was clear to anyone who was keeping an eye on daily print journalism in this country that Jim Wilsey had built the Star Ledger's newsroom into one of the best in America. But there was a trade-off too. John, this is what you wrote in your New Jersey Jewish News article about what occurred in a transition from Mort Pye to Jim Wilsey. Quote, when Pye left, so did much of the family feeling that had lifted and bonded the newsroom and the bureaus he created. Later, you added about the new newsroom employees being dismissive. Besides being dismissive of Ledger culture, many of these new hires were from out of state and unfamiliar with the folkways and byways of New Jersey. That's quite a shift, and I don't think you were alone in feeling that way. Is there something else you'd like to add?
I can only say that Jim's style was completely different than Mort's. And for anyone who had been groomed and grew up under Mort, it could be very jarring. Jim had, experience in San Francisco and New York. And Mort, even though he was a New Yorker, had been a Jersey guy for so long, became so obsessed with making Jersey relevant. I don't think that Jim brought the same sensibilities to the job when he came in. He had a lot of national contacts, and he brought in people from out of state who were very bright people, but just didn't have the, I don't know, the feel for New Jersey that some of the people at the Ledger did, nor were they encouraged. They were encouraged to strike out on a new cultural tangent of their own. And their conception of New Jersey was somewhat different than ours. And, listen, the results, the paper looked better, it read better, it won Pulitzers, but it didn't have that essential New Jersey DNA that it had while Mort was the editor.
Right. Jerry, how did the
Yes.
changeover affect you? What did you see? What did you feel?
Well, John really has gotten to the essence of the difference between the two editors of the paper. First of all, I liked Wilsey because the first thing he did when I met him, first day I met him, he said, I looked at your salary. He said, you are our name on the marquee. Everybody knows you everywhere. But then that's where he was reaching out to the whole country. So he gave me a $20,000 raise. Kept calling my bank, nothing bounced, nothing back. I couldn't believe it. But something else was important. Jim had this idea of New York flair, and a totally different newspaper. And I recall that he was more excited about things I did on a national level, like the earthquake that interrupted the World Series. I actually the next day saw the guy who was found underneath a car on the Nimitz Freeway and watched these 40 engineers around that bridge. The bridge was shaking back and forth. And they found a body who was alive in red sneakers. I remember that's a young lady saw the sneakers move under her car. And they jerry-rigged this Rube Goldberg device to get him over the side of the Nimitz and down where they could drive him to the hospital. And when they put that thing together and sent the living body of this guy down the side, all the engineers threw their fists in the air and cheered wildly as if they were saying, listen, you son of a bitch, that's one you're not going to get. And that impressed Wilsey more than a lot of other stories I did that I thought were better stories. but it was national, and we
Sure.
were on the way to a different kind of reputation.
Right. Okay, so then came 2008 with its severe economic downturn that led to management to significantly downsize the paper with buyouts. And frankly, the Star Ledger was never the same again. That one move, also attributed to the impact of the internet and cable TV on advertising and circulation, cost the paper 40% of its news staff. Heading out the door were not only 150 or so skilled and experienced reporters, editors, and photographers, but also most of the paper's institutional memory. Amazingly, the buyouts were offered even while employees had lifetime job security pledges in writing that were supposed to be good even in hard times. Wilsey retired the following year in 2009. As state and local coverage continued dwindling, the price of the paper kept rising, and news migrated to NJ.com, daily circulation at the Ledger did nothing but drop. Last year, it fell to a paltry 34,000 copies a day. Kevin Whitmer, a protege of Wilsey's from the Daily News in New York, followed Wilsey as editor of the Star Ledger, and on his watch, Amy Ellis Nutt won the paper's third Pulitzer Prize in 2011, this one in feature writing. It wasn't enough to turn the Ledger's fortune around, and Whitmer departed too. Unless I'm mistaken, the news operation today is run by a man named Chris Kelly, whose title is Vice President for Content. I'm guessing he's the one who will be overseeing the final press run of the paper on Sunday. So let's veer off into another area here. In the lead up to the program tonight, I asked each of you, and I did so myself, to prepare a list of the 10 people other than S.I. Newhouse who we felt were the most important in Star Ledger history. We agreed on 7 of them: Donald Newhouse, Mort Pye, Jim Wilsey, legal affairs writer Herb Jaffe, who's still alive, in his 90s and living in Las Vegas, education writer and columnist Bob Braun, who's also still kicking, sports editor Willie Klein, and while he wasn't allowed to vote for himself, there's no doubt Jerry would make that list too. As for the others, John included on his list publisher Marty Bartner, longtime news editor Dick Strong, and longtime managing editor Andy Stasiak. I had Andy Stasiak on my list as well, along with Philip Hochstein, the editor who preceded Mort Pye and helped S.I. Newhouse build his newspaper chain from the office on Halsey Street. I also had Jerry Nesbaum, a Newarker who wrote an enormously popular gossip column called Personally Speaking in the days when the paper was desperate for circulation. Nesbaum was on Jerry's list too, along with Sid Dorfman, a sports writer turned sports columnist who also ran Dorf Feature Service, which contracted with the Ledger to provide high school sports results, obituaries, and coverage of municipal night meetings. Also on Jerry's list were circulation director Dennis Carlotta and the one and only cartoonist and illustrator Bill, with one L, Canfield. Jerry, would you tell us a story about the time your name appeared in Jerry Nesbaum's column when you were a boy? It says a lot about how deep his reach was.
That's before we started to grow. We were, I think the circulation was like 80,000 or whatever, maybe less. I was a little kid, Newark Street kid, short pants. And I don't know why, but I was listening to a ball game on the radio, and I put a marble in my mouth and then I swallowed it. And my mother almost fainted. My father said, well, you give me a great task. And he cut out cardboard and would stick it in the toilet and then clean the toilet after each movement I had to see if he could find the marble in there. That was a Jerry Nussbaum type of story. He said, Jerry Eisenberg loves sports. He can tell you the Newark Bears batting averages and how many games the pitcher win, but he can't give his parents any clue as to what happened to that marble. That was a typical Nussbaum item.
Yeah, yeah. Talk about Sid a little bit, because he was your boss, wasn't he?
Sid was my first boss, my first newspaper boss.
This is Sid Dorfman.
Yep. And one of the things he did everything at the Ledger. He ran the school division, had a whole company, Dorf Features, covering all the high school stuff and local colleges other than Rutgers, small ones. He was a slot man, putting out the newspaper at night. He was a golf writer. He would also do a little boxing. He was in his hand was in everything. Well, he was looking for a place to put his high school staff, for the guys covering the high school stuff. He put us in a basement. That's not true. It wasn't a basement, it was a cellar, a dirty, filthy cellar on Court Street above a house owned by George Vann, who was the entire photographic department for a while and then began hiring people. One day I'm sitting down there and I got two guys that don't get along. And I'm just about to walk out and just walk around the block, get away from them. All I would do is fight. One went to Montclair State, one went to Philly Dickinson. They argued about everything. I got a headache. Now I'm walking to the door, which leads to the 3 steps you climb up and get out in the fresh air. I see a rat run across the room. I go upstairs to George and I say, George, you gotta get an exterminator in here. I'm not gonna live with rats. He said, not a problem. We're not getting no exterminator. Open the desk drawer and hands me a gun. Go, kill the rats. You didn't forget things like that. The paper, the Ledger had that kind of charming aspect to it. And for the older ones of us, that part never left.
Right. John, how about telling us about Dick Strong and Andy Stasiak and why you put them on your list?
Well, they were bread and butter journalists. They got the paper out day in, day out. Andy carried through Mort's directives and interacted with the staff.
John, tell us what their titles were.
Well, Andy was the managing editor, and Dick Strong was the news editor, really the night managing editor. And after the conference at about 6:30, the Daily Story conference, Andy would and Mort would tie up any loose ends, and the night staff would take over, and Dick Strong would be running the paper. He would be laying out the pages for the A book, the national book, the B book, the state book, and giving the local C book to the appropriate editor. Dick would also actually run between the newsroom and the back shop, supervising the printers. He would do a page layout, pass it to me. I was running the copy desk at the time. We would take the copy, assign the headlines, edit the stories, send them to the back shop. Now, this is going back to hot type. And Dick would be toggling between the newsroom and the back shop, making sure the printers were assembling the pages, that any logjam was resolved, and also moving copy from the wire desks and the city desk. He did that every night and then would field Mort's phone call. And Dick did that for decades. He and I rode to work together. And Andy, of course, was the enforcer on the day side. He made sure that assignments were carried out, that if we were beaten, we would get a second day story in the works immediately. And he was Mort's chief assistant and expediter. So those two guys were very apparent to me each and every day I was at the Ledger, and very important to the nuts and bolts operation of the paper.
Okay, great. So we're going to move to another area now. Last week, I sat down and began putting together a list of former staff members who distinguished themselves at other publications or in other fields after leaving the Star Ledger. I quickly came up with a list of 50 or more, and I'm certain I could have come up with many more had I continued. While we don't have time to go through them all, please indulge me for a moment in mentioning some of them because this list is so impressive. The New York Times has hired a number of Star Ledger staff members over the years. Several are there now, I believe. But Bob Herbert stands out as the Times' first Black op-ed page columnist, as does Farnaz Farshihi, who covers the UN and the Middle East. Sandy King went to the New Jersey Network, where for many years she hosted the award-winning legal affairs program, Due Process. Also moving to TV were Josh Margolin and Kimberly Brown, both at ABC News, Josh as a chief investigative reporter and Kimberly as executive editor of news practices, while Brian Donahue reported for News 12. Alan Sepinwall and Matt Zoller-Zeitz both continue writing about TV. Alan is chief TV critic for Rolling Stone magazine and Matt for New York Magazine. They've also collaborated on 2 books. Jim Warren became managing editor of the Chicago Tribune, a frequent TV panelist and also a respected media critic. Peter Marks became the chief drama critic of the Washington Post. Lucy Schulte served as editor-in-chief of the nationally circulated Self magazine, while Larry Hackett became managing editor of People magazine. Brad Parks and Wally Strobe are successful crime novelists, while Benilde Little's book, book was named one of the top novels of the year in 1996 by the LA Times. Ralph Nader hailed Bill Kleinek's 2023 book, States of Neglect, as, quote, the book I've been waiting for. Nick Childs has written more than 20 books, several of them bestsellers, while Pete Genovese has written more than a dozen books, mostly focusing on New Jersey food and New Jersey road trips. Mike Druniak became Chris Christie's spokesman, while Joe Donahue is the deputy director of the New Jersey Election Law Enforcement Commission. Paul Whitecroft serves as the government and external affairs officer for NJ Transit, and Brian Murray is the assistant county administrator of Morris County. Joe Carricker served in the administration of Brendan Byrne and then was head of the old Garden State Parkway Authority, while Tom Feeney is the spokesman for the New Jersey Turnpike Authority. Jim McQueenie was Senator Frank Lautenberg's spokesman before becoming a go-to political consultant and TV host. Fred Hillman also had a successful public relations career. Dory Devlin is the spokeswoman for Rutgers University. Sports writer Dan Graziano reports for ESPN, while Mike Vaccaro is a sports columnist for the New York Post. Tom Lucci today serves as the press officer for Monmouth Park. Mark Abraham is deputy director of the U.S. Senate Press Photographers Gallery, while Matt Rainey keeps winning awards for his photos, and photographer Pim Van Hemmen is the executive editor of Soundings magazine. Juan Ferrero is the South American bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. And finally, there is a handful of former staff members who upheld the grand tradition of unbiased reporting in the brave new digital world we find ourselves in today. Kevin Coughlin, who has taken MorristownGreen.com to new heights as its editor. John Ward, founder of RedBankGreen.com. Jay Lustig, whose NJArts.net covers much of the state's cultural scene, and NJ Spotlight News, the brainchild of John Mooney, Tom Johnson, and others, that started as a website and then carried over into the world of public television news. Let's give them all a special tip of the hat for taking a firm grip on the steering wheel and staying the course and keeping the public informed and the politicians and government officials honest. I apologize for any omission. And if there's anyone in the audience would like to add, I think you can do that in the chat box. Now, let's go to staff members who had famous relatives. First is Georgiana Franklin Brennan, a daughter-in-law of the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice William J. Brennan, Jr. She started at the paper as a summer intern in 1954 and was full-time from 1957 until 1971. Georgiana is still alive and living outside of Princeton. I spoke with her recently, and she told me the assignment she remembered most was interviewing passengers who had been rescued from the Andrea Doria, an ocean liner that sank in July 1956. But she was probably best known in her day for covering fundraisers, parties, and other type of social events that Mort Pye said was important in helping the Star Ledger extend its reach beyond Newark. Tom, can we have the next slide? Next is Mark Finston. The newsroom scuttlebutt was that Mark was a cousin of actor Tony Randall. And while he certainly resembled Randall facially, and had the same mannerisms, there's no mention of the connection in his obituary. Regardless, Mark was an enormous asset to the paper with his reporter-at-large feature story that he wrote just about every weekday for close to 25 years. Mark so much looked the part of a reporter that he was chosen as an extra in the movie The French Connection. Who knows, maybe with the help of Tony Randall. Mark had a gruff exterior, but was a sweet, lovable man at heart who lived and breathed his work. The newsroom took his loss extremely hard when he died in 1989 at the young age of 54. Jack Levine, a well-known American social realist painter from the Depression into the 1950s, 60s, and beyond, was the father-in-law of our beloved Lenny Fisher, a former Trenton bureau chief and city editor who died last year at the age of 80. Stefan Janis was the son of the famous American concert pianist Byron Janis. Stefan worked in a features department from 1982 to 1992. He died on vacation in France in 2017 at the age of 61. Kevin Richardson was the son of Ham Richardson, a two-time NCAA singles tennis champion and a #1 tennis player in the US in 1956 and 58. Kevin worked at the paper between 1989 and 1993. Tom, can we have our next slide? And finally, there is Edith Kermit Roosevelt, a granddaughter of President Teddy Roosevelt, who had the same name as Roosevelt's second wife. She worked as a reporter in the Halsey Street building from 1959 into the early 1960s. Georgiana Brennan remembered her as someone who had a very serious case of the nerves. She later became a syndicated columnist whose column Between the Lines was printed in 50 papers across the country, including the Star Ledger and other Newhouse papers. Her syndicate billed her as, quote, distinguished for her capacity to present complex situations affecting America's security and the Cold War in concise, clear language. Edith had made national news before she got to the Ledger when she married a Russian general who had defected to the US during the purges of Joseph Stalin and ended up working for the US government and testifying before congressional committees. She was 20 at the time of their marriage, and he was 49. Jerry, you were acquainted with Edith Kermit Roosevelt. Tell us how she came to be hired at the Ledger and how it worked out.
Well, Mort had the mistaken idea that her husband was going to become our whisperer. He was going to tell us all the secret things about the Soviet Union, the things that were happening, military secrets, whatever. To my knowledge, it ain't never happened. I was not a super fan of her. I didn't read her column that much, but I do remember her for boldness and determination, which I decided were her two, biggest assets, when I found her washing her hair in the office water cooler. I was not a fan, but she certainly was a character.
Okay. So with another thought, I recently went to eBay to see what Star Ledger items people were putting up for bid. I'd like to share some of them with you because I think they may bring back an amazing memory or two. Can we have our final slide? Old copies of the paper. These are the listings in no particular order. 9/11, Nixon's resignation, the first moonwalk, Devils winning the Stanley Cup, Yankees winning the World Series, Barack Obama winning the presidency, JFK's assassination, the capture of Saddam Hussein, the death of Osama bin Laden, and copies of Scanner with illustrations by Peter Ambush. Original Bill Canfield cartoons, umbrellas, copy of Gordon Bishop's Gems of New Jersey, a book about Rutgers football, a keychain commemorating the opening of the new office building in 1966, an adjustable hat with the Star Ledger logo, a canvas newspaper delivery bag, which sold for $120, by the way, a wooden bank delivery truck, hockey pucks, a cooler featuring a cartoon strip, which is currently listed for $499, T-shirts, a nylon jacket with the paper's name on the back, listed at $125, a Bon Jovi paper, and in case anybody's still looking for one, a Bracket Boy bobblehead doll, listed at $9.99, with no bids yet. So, Jerry and Tom, we've come to our final question of the night. How will you personally remember the Star Ledger, and how do you think this paper should be remembered?
Go ahead, Jerry.
The paper was, if it had been a person, let me say that again. If it were a fictional character, it would be Horatio Alger. The paper began with nothing except bankruptcy. It outlived the Depression and the things that really hurt this country. It lived through the wars. We sent people off to fight, and it was my life. I'm 94 years old. I spent over 70 years at that newspaper. When Stanley Woodward, who later took me to the Herald Tribune for 2 years, which he was the master of, he taught me at the Ledger how to write, when to write, and when not to write. He taught me that to be a columnist that people paid attention to, you had to learn to see and listen to everything around you. His advice to us at the Tribune and at the Ledger was, listen, athletes are people, stop turning them into demigods. He gave me a perspective on life which, outside of my father, filled the rest of my life, not only in the newspaper I loved, but he told me one thing, standing in the city room of the Star Ledger when I applied for a job after I had been a correspondent. The last thing he said was, I'm going to ask you one more question. Why, you're not making any money in those small papers you're working on. Why do you want to stay in this business? I looked at him thinking I was going to get brownie points, and I said, Mr. Woodward, I have always wanted to be a journalist. He stared at me like it was rubbing door crap off the bottom of his shoe. He said, son, you're in the wrong building. We don't have any journalists here. Samuel Pepys, who kept the diary that was published in England in the Elizabethan times, he was a journalist. All we have here is newspaper man. If you want to be a journalist, go over to the Times, get a 3-piece suit. They'll send you to Switzerland to cover financial stories. We don't do that here. And if I should hire you, which thank God he did, if I should hire you, never forget that this building is filled with newspaper men. I took that to heart to the point where when I made out what my grave plaque will be, the usual loving father, son, daughter, etc. And the last thing is one sentence. And those of us who went through the whole cycle at the Ledger can proudly say this sentence. He was a newspaper man.
Beautiful, John. Your feelings?
Well, it's hard to
Yes, it is.
go up against.
You should have gone first, John.
I was only there for 40 years. I feel like a Johnny-come-lately. I loved my career there for most of it. I thought I was doing important work. We were a product that was taken into people's homes. We were trusted by them. We helped mold their opinions about government. We brought government closer to them. We brought to their attention the things that needed to be fixed. And we played an important part in their life. And we did it for a long time. We did it well. We did it through peace, wars, depressions, whatever. And now that has come to an end and a digital chapter begins. For myself, I started as a stringer doing high school sports. And the moment I walked into the newsroom, the West Orange Chronicle, I loved the smell of the glue pots, the fool's cap. I loved the sort of low looks of the people who were behind the typewriters pounding away. And from that moment on, I knew I wanted to be in the newspaper business. And I hope I didn't let it down because it sure as hell didn't let me down. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so we've reached the end of the program. I'd like to express my deep appreciation to the library, to Jerry and John, and to all our viewers for spending their evening with us. But more importantly, my sincerest of thanks to each and every one of you, our viewers, for being loyal readers of the Voice for New Jersey for so many years. May the Star Ledger live on in history. Be well, and now let's go to Tom for questions and comments.
All right, thank you, Guy and Jerry and John. That was really terrific. So we do have a number of questions in the chat box, and if anybody else has any questions, please type them in the in the chat box. Okay, so let's say the first question that we have is, who came up with the idea of having the Newark section? Where did that idea come from?
Guy, do you want to take that?
Yeah.
No, well, I mean, it was Mort's idea after 67, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think it was totally Mort's realization that we had to get closer to our base city and cover it more intensively.
Yeah.
Okay. So another question related to that.
And I was going to say, by the way,
go ahead.
Barbara Kukla did a really good job with that section. I mean, she was as close to the people in Newark as anyone you could possibly want in that job.
Right. Amen to that.
Yeah, and she's mentioned elsewhere in the chat box too. But the question related to that question is, when did the Ledger start to open bureaus outside of Newark, and what were the first areas of expansion?
Well, Mort started the bureaus actually in the 60s, and they took off in the 70s. And the areas of Mort's favorite weekend hobby was he and his wife Pearl would go and tour the countryside, Somerset, Warren, Morris counties, looking to see how many green Star Ledger mailboxes were there and where they could be. And so he was actually out on weekends acting as a scout for circulation. But the bureaus really came of age in the 70s and 80s.
And the paper had a Trenton bureau for many years before that.
Oh, okay. All right. So how much female staff did the Ledger have outside the traditional women's pages in the 60s or 70s and later?
Well, I just want to add one thing about that, because in recent years, Sue Epstein, who was a reporter at the Star Ledger and covered Monmouth County for the paper for a long time, passed away. And some of the comments that were in the story was that Sue was a pioneer. Well, Sue was a good reporter, very nice lady, but frankly, she was not a pioneer for women reporters at the Star Ledger. There were a number of them, and not just in the women's department. So, as I said, Georgiana Franklin in the 50s was going out on news assignments for the Star Ledger, and there were a number of them after that. And when I got there were plenty of, in 1980, there were plenty of women in the newsroom, and John and Jerry could speak about even their years where I think there were women as well.
Well, I do know that when I came to the Ledger in 1967, Nancy Raisin was one of the key reporters. Nancy Jaffer, during the late 60s and early 70s, we started hiring more women. It was that simple. And they weren't hired, and I'm going to use an old misogynistic term, they weren't hired as sob sisters. They were hired as full-fledged reporters. And that only grew as the years passed. I don't have, hard numbers in front of me, but Mort was very aware of opening the ranks to women.
An interesting point there is that Nancy Jaffer had an international reputation with show horse people.
True.
And Mort never worried about, will this person fit into where I'm putting him or her. And it was up to the public to fit in with them, because most of them were pretty damn good.
And Willie opened up the sports department to women as well. I remember some Carol Hodis.
Yep.
Speaking of Carol Hodis, she's in the chat. She says, always felt blessed that I was brought in to start the women's sports column. She says, spent a couple of years at Dorf's before getting called up to the mothership by Willie Klein.
Yeah. Hello, Carol.
I remember when Mort said we were going to hire the first woman for the copy desk. And I looked at him and he looked at me and I looked at him again and he looked at me harder. And I said, okay, when does she start? And, then as a regular routine thing, we had women copy editors on the copy desk. And it was a breakthrough.
And I would like to interrupt and cite Ellen Chase, who is a real pro. I had many fights with her about words I wrote she didn't like. She's terrific.
And I think if Mort had any reluctance, John, about hiring women, is because those were night jobs, and he might have feared for them coming in and out of Newark, after dark and leaving in the early hours of the morning.
That's a good point, Guy. Yes. But I think that eventually was overcome, and they were accepted on totally equal footing.
Yes, absolutely.
And so Barbara Kukla is mentioned 3 times in the chat. It was actually in relation to when you were listing noteworthy former writers and staff members. She's mentioned by 3 different people. One person says, Barbara Kukla, great columns about Newark and books. Someone else says, please mention Barbara Kukla, who wrote the Newark section or edited the Newark section. People used to buy the paper on the day the Newark section came out just to see what was going on. She also wrote several historical books on jazz in New Jersey. And then someone else also says, yes, Barbara's weekly Newark section meant a lot to Newarkers.
Yeah, and she was an editor too.
Yeah.
Guy, one thing I'd like to say about Barbara Kukla, she has written a massive encyclopedia about jazz joints in Newark. And as a failed musician who really gave it a shot, that book is just the way the shit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a marvelous piece of research and writing.
Linda Lamandola and Joan Whitlow are also mentioned in the chat box as well.
Yes. Okay. Well, Joan was the newspaper's health and medicine reporter and columnist for many years, did a fabulous job. And then her last incarnation at the paper, she was a columnist who wrote about Newark City Hall when Sharp James was mayor, and she did an absolutely fabulous job. Linda, I didn't know too well, but she did work in the Trenton Bureau, covered health and human services down there. And I used to go down there to cover stories of my own at times. And let me tell you something, she was very highly respected in Trenton.
Absolutely. And that Trenton Bureau, our Star Ledger Trenton Bureau, which went from one person, Franklin Gregory, to 6 or 7 full-time staffers and a photographer, was a point of pride with the paper. No one could touch us in Trenton in State House coverage.
That's right. Linda Lamandola was a real pro.
So on another issue, we have a long question here, or a comment and question. At its peak, it seems the Ledger's business model relied more on revenue from advertisers than revenue from subscribers. Since advertisers have now all shifted from print media to the internet, traditional print papers like the Ledger are left behind, as well as thousands of other local papers. Digital advertising and the internet are not going away and have permanently shifted the media landscape. So what is the future of newspapers? How will they be funded in the future? Will they continue to close like the path of the Ledger? Or do you envision a state-funded model like the BBC in Britain or Deutsche Welle that are both funded through federal taxes? And what are the stakes? Without the Newark Evening News and now without the Ledger, how has reporting on local affairs in Newark changed? If not for reporting on corruption and fraud through newspapers and traditional journalism, what avenues do we have to hold our elected leaders accountable? That was a long comment, but that was all one person.
Well, there are a few news websites that cover Newark.
Yeah.
To varying degrees of success. It seems to me the Ledger is pretty much cut out of Newark, at least in terms of any really in-depth reporting. I don't know. I mean, this is something that every paper in America is facing.
Yeah.
And I remember when we left in 2008, at the end of 2008, Brad Parks who was a terrific reporter and doing very well as a novelist now, said, I don't think the Ledger is going to be around in 10 years. That was his prediction. And each year I used to count as the years went by. Well, the Ledger's now made it 17 before it's going out. And there are going to be more. There's no question about it. And we're losing papers all the time. I think that, at least for the time being, the big papers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, they'll have a print edition. But in the long run, who knows how long it'll last. But, someday I have no doubt that there won't be print newspapers.
I'd just like to add to that. The New York Times recently announced that it had achieved its 11 millionth digital subscriber and was going for 15 million. And there's no doubt that national papers like the Times, the Post, as their digital base increases, they're going to take down the print edition and probably eventually eliminate it and be all digital.
When I saw that the Times had bought that sports publication.
Yeah, the Athletic.
Yeah, the Athletic, thank you. When I saw they bought it, I said, this is the beginning of the end. The Times at one point, and I know because I was a part of that era, had the worst sports section in the universe.
Yep.
And when he decided to clean up, they were going to do Sports Monday, they were going to do this, they were going to do that. They came up with a decent sports section and a couple of really fine writers. Nothing like the Ledger had, in my opinion, but they went in the right direction. Now they have surrendered. You're going to find more and more papers disappearing. My own feeling, look, I just say one thing personally. I ran a summer camp for over and underprivileged kids that wanted to be reporters and newspaper people. I ran it for 12 years. It was a pretty good camp. We put 14 people actually into the newspaper business. One of them wrote a book. They were good. I want to write a letter to each one of them if I had their addresses to apologize because I sent them down the wrong road. And I couldn't ever bring myself to send them down the road of internet. Like I said earlier in this thing, you want the truth? If there's a newspaper left, buy it, read it, and support it, because you will never see mass corrections in any internet. So we were wrong, so it didn't happen, but we got a new headline tomorrow. That's the Rupert Murdoch mentality. I weep for all the gravestones that need to be put up on newspaper abandoned sites.
So one last question. Looking forward, are there any people still at the Star Ledger to whom readers can express their ideas regarding the impending closing? Do any of you know? You might know.
I don't know. I don't know
Yeah.
who's there now.
The person even says not that they think it's going to make much difference.
You can find it on either the masthead of the Star Ledger as it publishes the next few days, or if you go on nj.com, you can find the names of the people who are the content supervisors, as they call them nowadays, and with their email addresses, you could let them know. Okay. I don't think it'll do any good, but hey, if you want to vent and get something off your chest, feel free.
Okay.
It's not going to bring the paper back, though.
Guy, I'd just like to add one thing here. There should be a monument, and I mean it from my heart. There should be a monument to this newspaper and what it brought to people. And when I first started writing the column, this paper wasn't very big, and the news was the big thing. But I had people say to me, when they found out where I was going to work, how can you work there? I would never read that paper. Those people walked around with the New York Times under the arm to say people would say, oh, aren't they smart? They read the New York Times every day. The Star Ledger changed our circulation area. We made people think. That was part of my idea of writing a column. They didn't love it. When I went, we got 4,000 letters when I defended Ali the first time. But those letters are important. That's how newspapers learn what other people think and then either correct the impression they have about the subject or else say maybe they're right. but even newspapers were open to discussion in those days.
Jerry, this program is part of that Star Ledger Monument. That's why I wanted to do it. And thank you so much for your memories, for your insights, and you too, John. I couldn't have thought of two better people to do this tonight.
Thanks, Guy. Wonderful program. Thanks for bringing it all together.
Yeah, this
Thank
was
you.
great. Great. Thank you, Guy, for doing this. And
I
thank you,
thank you
Jerry and John.
because I thank you because those who are Jewish in the audience will know what I mean. We are sitting shiva for this great paper, and I will never forget it for the little time I have left.
Okay.
Amen.
Well, thank you to everyone. And a recording of this program will be available in a few days on the Newark Public Library's YouTube site. So for those of you who came in late and want to watch the whole thing. But that is our program for tonight. Thank you to our three guests for an engrossing talk. A special thanks to Guy Sterling for coordinating tonight's program and acting as moderator. And thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. As I said, a recording of this interview will be available later on the library's YouTube page. Good night, everyone. Be safe.
Night, Tom.
Good night.